Coming up, there's a strange drought in northern France, with winds so cold you'd expect it were autumn.
Oui, c'est vrai qu'on peut avoir quelques doutes, on se demande si on n'est pas au mois de novembre.
Temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius in Iran. The government announces a controversial plan to deal with the unprecedented heat.
نه من مخالفم. من میگم آقا اشتباس تعطیلات هیچ کمکی به این قضا شاید نمیدم. حالا
And is global warming getting to you?
Climate change is here, it is terrifying, and it is just the beginning.
We look at the language coming from leading experts and the so-called doom-monger eco-activists, and whether it all has an effect on how we perceive climate change.
We are not going to accept the current situation.
This is Just 2 Degrees on TRT World.
Just take me for a
The World Meteorological Organization has talked about the impacts of the El Nino weather phenomenon on agriculture across the globe. El Nino warms sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern tropical Pacific, and it triggers changes in global weather like flooding in dry areas and drought in places that tend to get rain. It's problematic for crops that rely heavily on consistent supplies of water, like corn, citrus fruits and wheat. Countries likely to be exposed are Brazil, the world's leading producer of sugarcane, soya and coffee, India, the world #2 producer of rice and potatoes, and Australia, which relies heavily on barley and rapeseed exports.
As the El Nino develops, there will be different parts of the world will experience the impacts differently. So for some parts of the world, there could be drought associated with El Nino. And so the impact of drought clearly is not good on agriculture. And so for communities that can do so, they would need to consider irrigating their crops. Other parts of the world could experience floods, and so depending on the severity of the floods, that could also impact agriculture. It could destroy crops.
There have been a number of weather abnormalities this summer. In early August, as southern Europe was battling heat waves, there were strange cold winds around northern France, near the English Channel. It was the type of weather the region normally sees in November during autumn. Wind speeds reached 80 kilometers per hour with temperatures between 17 and 20 degrees Celsius. The average for August is around 24 degrees.
Oui, c'est vrai qu'on peut avoir quelques doutes, on se demande si on n'est pas au mois de novembre.
Dr. Markham Mystery joins me to discuss this. He's an assistant professor in climate and geospatial modelling at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Doctor, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me here today.
So people wearing jackets in the middle of summer in France, how does one explain such cold and windy weather in August?
Well, firstly, I'm wearing a jacket myself and I'm based in London. And I can tell you that it's reasonably cold over here for this time of the year. And, we have to understand the climate itself is a complex system. There is a natural variability in the climate that can affect patterns that are not expected at this time of the year in different parts of the world. So, as you mentioned earlier, we saw severe heat waves in southern Europe, and now some of these places are suddenly seeing a drop in temperature with storms and sort of a shift in weather pattern. So these are not totally unexpected, but we are in the middle of a strong El Nino event, which is a natural variability in the climate system that occurs on 3 to 7 year timescales. And these kind of weather patterns can be expected even far-reaching in Europe and Northern America, for instance, though the El Nino event itself is forming in the Pacific Ocean, but it can have impacts far beyond that. To add to that, we are also seeing a gradual rise in the global average temperature, which scientists have repeatedly shown are related to human-induced climate change. So this itself is adding sort of an extra thermal energy in the system that's affecting the natural variability. It's very difficult to predict in advance where these kind of short-term timescales weather events can occur. The weather forecast models tend to work on a reasonable timescale of 7 days ahead, But beyond that, it becomes very difficult to predict in advance if we are going to see a sort of a shift in these short-term weather patterns.
Doctor, I'm wondering if you could help us clear up this entire issue. Where you are in the UK and I guess in northern France, it's supposed to be a lot warmer because it is summer. But is El Nino affecting the planet's currents to such an extent that it's colder where you are now? How does that work if El Nino is a warming event?
So what happens in a typical natural variation in the climate, such as the El Nino, and I'll come to another event such as El Nino a little later, is that it affects the large-scale global weather patterns, which can result in a shift of wind patterns, for instance, or stalling of wind patterns over a particular region, as we saw that happened in July, where we had a high-pressure region over Spain and Greece, Italy, which was basically containing a warm mass of air over there and not allowing it to dissipate. Similarly, in the North Atlantic also, we have another weather regime, which is called the North Atlantic Oscillation. And currently, the North Atlantic sea surface temperatures are above normal. So this also brings in sort of an extra energy to the system, shifting the wind patterns. So it can happen that the winds that are previously blowing from mid-latitudes, for instance, are now coming in from much higher latitudes in the northern hemisphere, bringing in this polar cold air mass. And this is what we refer to, climate scientists, we refer to this as a teleconnection, where an event in the tropical Pacific can also have far-reaching consequences in the opposite part of the world.
Well, really well explained. Thank you for that, Professor. So just to recap, in January, we saw the 6th warmest and 3rd wettest days in history. February, unexpected snow in parts of the southern U.S. March, Cyclone Freddy hit Madagascar and Mozambique. That storm lasted for more than a month. In April, tornadoes killed nearly 24 people in the American Midwest. There were also record heat waves in parts of Southeast Asia. In May, wildfires that, we're still getting smoke from began in Canada. And Cyclone Mocha in May also killed hundreds of people in Myanmar and Pakistan. We also saw Typhoon Mawar hit Guam. It was one of the strongest storms in history. June, nearly 170 people died during heat waves in India. July, some of the hottest days on record. People are still talking about it. This is really awkward, isn't it? And additionally, what kind of effect or impact do you think this will have on food, on agriculture across the world?
So you bring a very vital point. Indeed, we are in the midst of an unusual year as far as the weather patterns are concerned, if I can say so. We have seen extremes in both temperature as well as rainfall occurring in different parts of the world, and this can have direct impacts on agriculture. What happens is we are potentially looking at a drought on one side of the planet and flooding events on the other side, which can affect crop productivity at different scales, leading to a sort of a pressure on the entire food production and global trade system. So this is indeed a very difficult situation that we are currently facing this year. Whether this is going to happen on a far more frequent basis, it's a bit difficult to answer, but the climate model simulations that we use to model these kind of events do show that with the increase in the global average temperatures, we are likely to have more intense and more frequent wild weather events.
Dr. Mistry, really appreciate speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Well, fishing communities and activists rushed to clean up an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Environmental officials say oil has been washing ashore Lerma Beach after a leak that began in early July, allegedly involving the state's energy giant Pemex. The company acknowledged there had been a leak but claimed it was fixed. Pemex said the source of the pollution on Lerma was the result of, quote, natural hydrocarbon emissions.
La presencia en estas cantidades, por supuesto, va a ser una afectación ambiental grave. Eran más de 100 kilómetros cuadrados de hidrocarburos en el mar y esto se fue con las corrientes marinas dispersando a lo largo de todas las playas que se encuentran en el Golfo.
Pues estamos viendo que está llegando a la costa una gran mancha de hidrocarburo, petróleo, chapopote como le decimos por acá, y está bastante fuerte en esta ocasión. Vemos que toda la costa, aproximadamente 500 metros de costa, está pues bastante invadido de esta gran mancha negra.
Overwhelming heat prompted Iranian authorities to declare a 2-day holiday in August. The measure was taken to encourage the elderly and people with health conditions to stay indoors in temperatures exceeding 51 degrees Celsius in some parts. Several cities have suffered from more than 1 day of dangerously high heat, but not everyone agrees that a holiday is the best solution.
این هوا واقعا خیلی گرمه و باید آدم هم لباسای تابستونی پوشید. نه همه چیزام نخیه. آره. لباسای گشاد و اینا میپوشن.
نه من مخالفم. من میگم آقا اشتباه تعطیلات هیچ کمکی به این قضا شاید نمیدم. حالا چه اتفاقی من چیزی که میبینم چیز کمکی خاصی فکر نمی‌کنم بشه.
دولت به جای تعطیل کردن به نظر میرسه که باید روشش رو تغییر بده از تعطیلی به سمت مدیریت تولید و مدیریت مصرف.
Sanem Mahoozi is on the show. She's an Iranian environmental journalist. Hi there, Sanem. It's good seeing you.
Hello.
Firstly, how are people coping with 50 degrees Celsius weather in places like Baghdad?
It's very difficult to cope in these situations. Some of these provinces are hitting 60 degrees Celsius, provinces like Khuzestan and Sistan and Baluchistan. And these provinces are dealing with a trifecta of environmental problems, heat waves, sand and dust storms, and a situation named water bankruptcy, meaning that the available amount of water in the country is significantly less than the demand. It's not easy to cope in these kind of situations. There's been a surge in hospital admissions in some of these provinces, and basically the government's response to these heat waves in recent days has been to shut down the country for 2 days in response to the recent heat waves.
So what is that meant to do exactly? Just keep the cars off the roads?
So usually the government responds to environmental problems in 2 ways. One is to shut down the country, like like when there's pollution or when there's dust storms, or even in this case with heat waves, or they divert blame to other entities and other institutions, other countries even. In this case, heat waves, the interesting point that I wanted to mention is that the government announced on Tuesday that they're going to shut down the country for 2 days in order to respond with these heat waves. But the reports that we're getting out of Iran from journalists, from experts, and even some of the people is they say that the reason for the shutdowns is not actually because of heat waves, but it's because of the government trying to manage electricity cuts.
Where does Iran normally get its electricity? And why have there been electricity cuts? I guess there's less water, less dams working.
Yes, well, that's part of it. But part of it is also mismanagement of the government of the resources that has caused these problems in recent months or even years.
Sanem, can you give us an outline of exactly how the government is achieving its climate goals, if it is at all?
The short answer is no. Basically, Iran is on the top list of highest, top 10 list of highest contributors to CO2 emissions. And also it's one of the 3 countries left, including Yemen and Libya, to ratify the landmark Paris Agreement aimed at curbing and fighting climate change. So one of the recent responses of the government was when the head of Iran's Department of Environment at COP26, the climate change summit in Glasgow, spoke to BBC World and said that the country is not going to ratify the Paris Agreement unless the U.S. sanctions are lifted. So he told BBC World that basically the ratification of the Paris Agreement is contingent on the lifting of U.S. sanctions.
Interesting. Yeah, I was just going to mention that Iran is not a good friend of the West at all. It's been under heavy sanctions for years. I guess these sanctions, of course, inhibit the country's ability to transition to fossil fuels. Sorry, to transition away from fossil fuels.
Well, the main problem in Iran is mismanagement. Sanctions, like climate change, is just a catalyst. The main problem that the country is facing with is the mismanagement of resources, mainly the water resources, along with other things. Sanctions are just a catalyst,
Sanem,
not the main cause.
Do you know at all whether Iran has done anything in terms of renewable energy?
I'm not sure about that. I'm sure. I think when the nuclear agreement JCPOA was signed, I think there was some interest in foreign investment in Iran, but I don't think any of that materialized. I'm not 100% sure.
All right, Sanem, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
No problem.
In Poland's Carpathian Mountains, deforestation has reached alarming levels, and logging threatens the habitats of brown bears and other rare species. The mountain range is supposed to be among the best preserved in Europe, but only 3% of it is strictly protected. According to a Greenpeace report, an area of forest more than 5 football pitches in size has been lost to wood extraction every single hour since November.
This dot here means most probably that this fair was designated to be logged. Here, just 1 meter below that, we see markings done by a bear. If you look on the other side of this creek, like 50 meters from us, maybe 40, they were logging last year. And so they cut down trees, and basically I'm standing right in front of a bear den. This is a big one. This is the biggest in this part of the forest. I mean, there are many forests where you can, log trees without doing a lot of harm to nature because they were planted by humans. They are basically monocultures. Whereas here, it is a fully working ecosystem where you have bears, where you have lynx, where you have wolves, where you have wildcats.
And more trouble with illegal logging in the Carpathian Mountains, but this time in Romania, forest engineers are turning to technology to fight back against ongoing deforestation. They've installed cameras in key places to catch and track illegal loggers and broadcast their activities on YouTube. But it is a challenging task putting an end to it.
Problema gravă este cea a furtului sistematic, furtului organizat, în care instituții, autorități ale statului care ar trebui să păzească într-un fel devin complici în a organiza ceea ce poate fi ulterior văzut ca un abuz asupra pădurii. Tot lemnul care coboară și iese din pădure este obligat să treacă prin acest punct, care e o primă condiție pentru instalarea acestor camere de filmat, să fie un punct obligatoriu de tragere care nu poate fi ocolit. Ei, aici nu prea ai pe unde să-l ocolești, căruță sau camion trebuie să treacă prin fața camerei. Care pentru mine ce era important? Cum am zis și mai jos, accesul în pădure. Camerele care să vadă ce urcă, ce coboară și doi, un obstacol fizic. Și acum, după cum vezi că e o barieră înălțată, adică aici nu e oprit tot traficul, dar, cum am zis, furtul ăla mărunt, omul cu căruța poate să treacă, dar nu mai era o problemă. În schimb, ceea ce trebuia controlat era accesul camioanelor.
Since Jim Skea, the head of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, criticized activists for, quote-unquote, paralyzing the fight against global warming because they spread so-called messages of doom, there's been a lot of discussion about whether that's actually the case. Does language by, say, the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, when he said we've entered the era of global boiling, harm efforts to counter the climate crisis? Well, let's discuss this with Dan Mitchell, Professor of Climate Science at the University of Bristol. Hi there, Dan. Dan, it's good seeing you. Firstly, do you agree that messaging by climate activists when they say blocking streets about the world is going to burn if nothing is done, do you agree with that type of messaging to convince people to act on climate change?
Yeah, well, to start with, there's a frustration, and certainly you see that in the activist groups with the lack of action from governments. And whenever you get that sort of frustration, you inevitably get more and more strong language. And I think that's what we're seeing through those particularly extreme groups, is just that frustration coming through, and therefore displaying that in terms of sort of quite colourful language. Not always backed up by facts, though, and that's where some scientists would take the issue.
Do you agree that it's paralyzing the fight? I mean, many young people just think that we're at the point of no return and we have to do something urgently, and hence urgent language is needed. But do you think that it's counterintuitive?
Well, I don't think it's paralyzing the fight, no. I think there's some interesting psychology behind it, and the more you say something is inevitable, or the more you say something is just so bad, it actually switches off people's ability to really address the problem. If they think, oh, well, it's so bad, we can't do anything about it, they don't really want to think about it. And so there is some paralyzing going on there, of course. Again, these people are frustrated in terms of how quickly governments are acting. And the simple answer is we're very unlikely to achieve our lowest Paris Agreement climate goal anymore, which is 1.5 degrees. We're more likely to go to 2, or probably even exceed that. And I guess coming from these activist stances, they're really sort of saying, well, we want to get to those. We know what the impacts will be, so we're going to use this slightly more colourful language to get us there. I don't think it's paralysing the problem, but it's probably not doing as much help as they think it is either.
And you know, Skea would agree with you. He himself said that the world will overshoot Paris targets. Would you say that the climate movement has made mistakes? We've been seeing more and more pictures of people physically attacking activists out of sheer frustration. Do you think it's a mistake blocking a street? Is there another way? Or do you think that the urgency requires it?
I think we're in a global crisis. We know how many people will die from climate change. We've got very good numbers now of those, and it's not thousands, it's not tens of thousands, it's in the hundreds of thousands. And again, it's the frustration going on which is causing this. Now, if governments were on election cycles which allowed them to really address the climate change problem, then perhaps these people wouldn't be out there. Personally, I don't go on climate strikes or do any sort of activism, because I try to keep that as a separate part of my life. But I don't necessarily disagree with what they're doing, although I think it could be better targeted.
Got it. Point taken. What about the flip side of the coin, Dan? There are lots of climate disinformation campaigns that target kids and some adults that say pretty much things like, you know, you can continue eating meat, it's not a problem. But if you just lessen your intake, that will be better for the climate and you'll be doing your part. Do you think those types of campaigns, particularly when scientists would say that the best way forward is to cut fossil fuel use, cut animal agriculture?
Yeah, again, it comes back to this interplay between what the science says and what society does, and the psychology of society. Now, you know, some people will say, yes, let's all go vegetarian, let's stop eating meat. And of course, that would do wonders for the climate crisis. But the reality is that's never going to happen. And we need to stop kidding ourselves to thinking we're going to convert everything to vegetarian. Now, everyone who can reduce their meat intake, great. That's a really good thing that you can do personally. That's not going to solve the climate crisis. So we need to look at other solutions, and we need to understand different technologies, and especially carbon capture and storage. We really need investment into that area, because we need to take some of this stuff directly out of the atmosphere.
Dan, really great points. Appreciate your time. Thank you for chatting with us.
Thanks.
And we close with shots of residents in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, as they do what they can to cool off during a scorching heat wave. Many jumped into and swam in the Tigris River. Temperatures there regularly rise well above 45 degrees Celsius, even reaching 50 degrees. Fuel shortages and high demand leads to cuts in electricity, only adding to the problem.